Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Atlantic Council, also our online audience. Welcome as well. We're so pleased you could join us to look at an issue of critical importance, and I think we're understanding that this is becoming real world in an even more compelling fashion than we thought maybe a couple of years ago. And that's how does the intelligence community respond to escalating and evolving threats. The relationship between intelligence and strategy is an area that the Atlantic Council is focused on, particularly in the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security, with our sustained analysis of global trends in our Strategic Foresight Initiative, where the director is Matt Burrows, currently and formerly of the National Intelligence Council, appropriate for this evening. At the Council, we pride ourselves on building a network of experts dedicated to understanding what the future holds, and then to think creatively about solutions and creatively about strategy for the future. It's not easy work. Brent Scowcroft often argues that strategy during the Cold War was easy because you had containment of the Soviet Union, containment of communism, and then the tactics were difficult. Now he complains that we're all tactics and not enough strategy, and of course intelligence is a lot about informing what our strategy ought to be. One of the best experts I've talked to over the years on any number of issues, but as you know, I'm a recovering journalist of the Wall Street Journal, and you always tried to turn to the smartest people to inform your own ideas so you could steal theirs whenever you could. And I always enjoyed stealing Greg Treverton's ideas from his various incarnations in government, at CFR, at Rand. We met in Europe, I think even more often than in the United States. Recent events in the Middle East and Eastern Europe have radically changed the foreign policy conversation in Washington and reinforced the importance of timely, accurate, and appropriately disseminated intelligence analysis. Very often, it may seem the world of intelligence is distant from the policy realm, but as any strategist knows, the strategy is only as good as the intelligence is based on. Looking from the case of WMDs in Iraq, the hunt for Osama bin Laden, you could just list and list. And you can list a lot of positive cases as well. The next landmark Global Trends 2030 report forecast that we were living in a world of rising non-state actors, revisionist powers, and exponential technological change. I think we're all seeing that accelerating even faster than we thought it would. In fact, I think that's probably one of the most interesting findings of these global trends reports is if they've underestimated anything, it's been the pace of change. With that as prelude, we have the pleasure of welcoming a thought leader tackling these issues, Dr. Gregory F. Treverton, Greg Treverton, the newly appointed chairman of the National Intelligence Council. He's previously served as as director of RAND's Center for Global Risk and Security, as well as a professor at the Pardee Rand Graduate School, where he served as associate dean for research. Prior to joining RAND, he was vice chairman of the NIC, where he oversaw production of the government's premier assessments of international problems, the National Intelligence Estimates. What years were you vice chairman?
It was 93, 96.
93, 96. So I think I may start there. The Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, called you to do this job for your combination of world-class analytical skills, broad substantive expertise, passion for the intelligence profession, and a deep understanding of the NIC's unique role and mission. So I think we'll talk a little bit in this conversation. I'll ask a few additional initial questions, and then we'll get into Q&A. And so clearly he called you the right man at the right time, and I think that's absolutely right. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you.
One last housekeeping note. We have a hashtag for this event. That's probably something new in terms of your Nick appearances. So we encourage you to tweet away using the hashtag, and I apologize in advance for this hashtag, hashtag ACDisrupt. So with that, Greg, let's get started. Why don't we start with your time when you were vice chair, and you're back now, and there I think you were vice chair under Joe Nye,
Right.
who was the chair. So coming back into the building, coming back into this NIC capacity, how's it different? Both in terms of how the place operates and then also substantively.
Great, great. Well, it was a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the NIC and the intelligence community intelligence task in general. The biggest change coming back, as you can see, I'm a slow to rise. It took me 15 years to go from vice chairman to chairman, but it's great being back. Interesting enough, I still have the same phone number I had all those years ago. So some things change more slowly. The big change really is the operating environment. When I was at the NIC before, we basically only did more strategic work, not just national intelligence estimates, but more strategic in the sense of putting the pieces together, putting issues in context, and often taking a little longer look at particular issues. We didn't have much role at all in current intelligence. That's a dramatic change. Now, the NIC is responsible for doing the intelligence preparation of the principals committees and the deputies committees.
When did that all begin to shift?
It all really began with Clapper, I think, when Jim came in, and working out the arrangements between the CIA and the DNI, Director of National Intelligence. The CIA still does most of the work on the President's Daily Brief, but now the DNI delivers it. Ditto on the PCs and DCs. We turn to all the agencies for help, but we're the people that do the quality control, put them together when an interagency, when an intelligence community-wide view of a particular issue is wanted. So that's the big change. It makes us, on the good side, makes us relevant, means we're in the thick of things, and means critically we know what's going on, which is always a great problem in intelligence, knowing what, policymakers have some idea what they'd like to accomplish over the next 2 years, but often have no idea at all what they're going to do next Tuesday. And so trying to keep up with policy in those circumstances is a real challenge. The cost is that it is a hugely consuming effort. And so for the busy accounts like the Middle East, like Russia, my national intelligence officers feel like they spend most of their time either preparing for meetings, going to meetings, or writing short response memos after those meetings. Last year we did in the range of 15 national intelligence estimates. We did about 900 pieces of paper. More than half of those 900 were memos, specific memos to Susan Rice or Tony Blinken about particular issues that came out of the DCs, or more rarely the PCs. The DCs mean an awful lot more often than the PCs. So that's the really big change. The thing that hasn't changed, other than my phone number, is the people. It's still a terrific collection of the national intelligence officers and their deputies particularly. It's just a world-class set of people. I feel like I get to go every day to a world-class intellectual salad bar, and it really is a treat.
Well, before we get to the substantive issues of it, where do you think you want to adjust that needle between real-time and long-term?
That is the big challenge I face. I think that's the issue number one on my agenda, is trying to think about and, to the extent necessary, recalibrate that balance. It means finding ways to let people have time, energy to do somewhat longer or somewhat broader thinking. I had a really good deputy national intelligence officer, works on Russia. He said, I really liked getting to do this strategy piece, a little longer term strategy piece. He said, unfortunately, I only had 6 hours to do it. So deep thought in 6 hours is probably not a great idea. So finding ways to let that more strategic, not always longer term, but putting things in context, finding ways to do that is really the big challenge. Now, happily, many of the questions that come out of the DCs are pretty straightforward. but many of them are quite interesting. We'll get a kind of a what if, well, what if we do this, how will Putin...
DCs for the uninitiated.
Sorry, deputies committees, the main policymaking committee on the foreign policy side in the US government. There's committees below that, and then there's the principals committees above them, but as a practical matter, it's the DCs that do most of the work and sort of tee up decisions for the principals. Sometimes they'll ask us really interesting questions, just the sort that I'd like to engage with policy. If we do this, how will Putin respond? What's your assessments of how Putin will respond? Mm-hmm. So those are ideal, and as a first task, then I need to sort of begin to develop a better count, because it's not the case that all of those memos are only information and only the NIEs are more strategic. There's a middle ground, and so trying to figure out exactly how our work breaks down, that's the first task.
Before going present tense into the future on substance, since you've raised Russia, why don't we go back a little bit to when you were there before? Everyone argues, should we have known where things were going? Could we have altered things? What was our role in the outcome that we're now experiencing today? With my knowledge of your knowledge in these areas, what is your take on when you were last at the NIC in terms of how one was looking at that? And part of the reason I'm asking this is this interesting mixture of long-term trends and short-term action. So if you're trying to look at Russia out 10, even 5, even certainly 20 years is hard, but 5, 10 years, you may make smarter decisions about today. So take us back a little bit right now, and then how do you play that out right now? What sort of intellectual process did we go through then, and what sort of intellectual process ought we be going through right now?
Well, one thing that strikes me is this seems to me a kind of interesting inflection point in global politics, maybe the third in the last generation or so. One was obviously the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of communism. Second was 9/11. Now, 9/11 was easier because it seemed to come with instructions attached, right? It said, here's what you do. You go after these bad people. But so this feels to me a lot more like the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of communism, where one geopolitical framework for thinking about the world has gone, but it hasn't quite yet replaced with another. It seems to me the first time around when the Soviet Union fell, we so quickly said, well, that's over, right? That's over. And while I think that, as a policy person at the time, I thought that the expanding of NATO and all those things was a good thing to do, we probably were, in retrospect, pretty dismissive. And part of Putin's attitude plainly feels like he and Russia were dissed by the West for a couple of decades. And that obviously does have some effect. It doesn't explain him, but I think it happened because we sort of quickly went to, well, now that's over. The Cold War's over, and now Russia is no longer a threat, no longer a major power, and we sort of jumped quickly to a different attitude toward Russia that is, in some sense, part of the sweep of what we're confronting now. It's interesting if you think about, sometimes we think that change takes a long time. I guess what strikes me is if you look backward, the distance between the evil empire and the fall of the Soviet Union was just slightly over a decade. So it does mean that things can go very quickly from time to time.
My staff here, I'm so glad you raised the point of inflection point, because we're kind of living by that argument right now at the Atlantic Council, in a way, drawing it out of the Global Trends 2030 report, where the inflection points listed there were 1919, 1945, 1989. And the argument being that at these points in history, decisions of leaders had outsized importance because you were at a plastic moment in history where things could be molded and shaped, and et cetera, et cetera. You use different inflection points here. And this then gets to my point of how is your job different than it was then? How big is this inflection point? Is it of this historical dimension, end of World War I, end of World War II, end of the Cold War? And if so, how does that influence the job that you've got to do inside the NIC?
Yeah, I think obviously it's, I don't know the honest answer to, I don't know whether it's as big as those other ones,
Yeah.
but it seems to be a very significant one in the sense that we are sort of scrambling around for a view, a lens with which to apprehend this world, to mix a metaphor. And that, I think, means a real challenge for intelligence to try and help people build that lens or that story. I've come to think that intelligence is about helping people create and adjust stories in their head. And we know when the story gets too firm, sometimes we call that mindset, and often results in what gets called an intelligence failure. But if there's not a story, then new information just kind of bounces around. It's a factoid. You don't know where to put it. It's hard for intelligence and policy to have a conversation. So one of the Churchill lines that he probably didn't say, he's supposed to have said after a particularly undistinguished meal, asked what he thought of it. He said the pudding, that's dessert for the English, lacked a theme. Well, I think our world lacks a theme, and so trying to provide a story or a lens, that seems to me to be a job, a formidable job for us to do working with policy people. As I said, whether this ranks with 1989 or 1992 in importance, don't know, but it does seem like we're, again, in a pretty shapeless world where it's easy to get dominated by tactics.
How about regionally, as you're coming in, and how the world is different than it was then? What were your regional priorities? You know, in this world of challenges, the Middle East, Ukraine, Far East, South China Sea, Ebola, global financial stability. What are your what keeps you up late at night? But what are your,
Right.
how do you set your priorities in the job that you're doing right now, and where would you set them both in regional sense and in a subject sense?
Well, in a very real sense, we sort of set our priorities by what's in front of us. I mean, you can't, the big crises are going on and need to be handled. The challenge with those is to try and help people step a little bit up and say, okay, now here are the tactics. What are we trying to get out of this? What's a realistic end game, or at least end point to this particular set of crises? Not very easy, hard to do, but so those will define, and I think for the remainder of the administration, of course, the Middle East and Russia are going to be dominant themes, ones we need to tend, and as I say, keep trying to raise people's sights a little bit to beyond the immediate tactical to, what are we trying to do here? What's our ultimate point here, given realistic possibilities? I don't get to have too many priorities in my current job, though, as I said to somebody the other day, I spent my whole career avoiding the Middle East. That's over. As the kids would say, that's so over, right? So I've learned a lot.
Hashtag AC Disrupt.
Right. Otherwise, on my personal list, I think China and East Asia has got to be top of that list. There are just so many things going on there, so much chance of the multiple issues at play, connecting in ways, people making miscalculations. We know that there are going to be bumps ahead in the road for China. We don't know how bad they're going to be, but there are going to be some bumps, and there may be some good ones as well. So I think that the combination of issues there in a region that doesn't have strong security agreements, mostly bilateral with us and allies. So that's kind of top of my list. Next, I think on my own personal list is really cyber, where from where I sit, we really still haven't calibrated the threat. And it's very hard to calibrate the threat. It's very dynamic, and we're divided in ways that make it hard to have a complete view. We have, the civil part of the government, the military part of the government. We have the private sector that has all the infrastructure and does all the stuff. We have the government, and we have offense and defense. And working across all those divides makes it, I suppose, no surprise that we haven't really calibrated the threat. So that's high on my list. And now,
and globally, offense is stronger than defense at the moment.
Well, I think we don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's part of calibrating the threat. And then as you said earlier, Fred, I was really happy when the Cold War ended, because quite apart from everything else, it had become boring. Right? It had become a sort of a managerial problem, and we knew that if we kept our alliance together and kept ourselves strong, we'd win in the end. We didn't expect to win in 1992 or even in our lifetimes, but we knew we'd win. So it was in that sense, sort of kind of boring because it meant that all these great ideas you had to sort of swat down because they sowed disunity in the alliance and were bad, therefore, for the alliance. So it was really kind of a management problem. So I wasn't very interested in Europe for a long time, but now I am. Now in Europe, too, seems to be going through a very difficult set of passages, and so it's very much on my list as well.
In what sense Europe? Europe as unfinished experiment, Europe as
in almost all those. Europe
yeah.
as Europe as a partner. We know that for all the other countries around, Europe is still our main partner, but its capacity is diminishing, particularly in the military sphere. And then there's Europe as an ongoing venture. In the short run, there's the Euro crisis, which is not over, by all means. And then there's the longer-term question, it seems to me, about the European construction. In a very funny way, that Europe has succeeded well enough so that Catalonia and Scotland don't need countries. They can just have Europe. And then there's the looming question of Europe's neighborhood, both northern, of which we're very aware now, but slow to come to grips with, I think, in Europe, and also its southern border as well. So again, I put it on the list because so much is in motion there, in flux, both inside Europe and with respect to it and its neighbors.
Let me stay there for one question, given that we're the Atlantic Council and we talk a lot about this here. Clear to us the role of the transatlantic relationship and alliance during the Cold War and its centrality. How do you apply it to today's world and the uncertain world that we're facing in terms of importance, centrality, relevance?
I think there's been change. There certainly has been change. We always used to say in the Cold War that if we use the old line, if we don't hang together, we'll hang separately. That wasn't quite right, but it was evocative. And we did manage, I think, a pretty impressive degree both of continuity in American policy toward the alliance over lots of different administrations and of unity inside the alliance. That's changed significantly, it seems to me, with the end of the Cold War. But as I said earlier, Europe is still our main set of partners, our main set of company in the world, and so we continue to have a stake in them. I just made my first trip as chairman a couple of weeks ago and was in Europe for a week, and I kept bumping into people raising questions about values. Or do we really have the same set of shared values across the Atlantic that we used to? And there are also divisions on both sides. So the Europeans would talk a lot about the disconnect between their peoples and their governing arrangements, just as seems to be the case in this country. So there are lots of similarities, but the question of whether that kind of stickum of values, and partly maybe generational, that the people who fought the Cold War grew up assuming that we'd be allies, and if the folks who've come of age since the early 1990s just don't have that same experience. So there are interesting, I think, currents. I found on this trip for the first time echoes of. So I'll be interested to see what you think, Fred. I was used to anti-Americanism on the right in Britain. This is the first time I'd seen it on the right in Germany, and it was the same ilk. Kind of mostly cultural. These people are crass, kind of bumbling. And by the way, they're trying to sell us a form of capitalism and regulation that's distinctly inferior to the one we have. So that was new to me.
And a curious romance with Putin.
And a curious romance still with Putin for all the sea change in German
Let me suggest a theme to your pudding, and then move on to another theme. Could the theme be sustaining, defending the liberal international world order? Is that what's at question right now, whether or not that's going to happen in the coming generation? And is that then a new task for the transatlantic community?
Yeah, I think, again, all those words are so loaded that I'm not sure I'd subscribe to them immediately. But building, maybe it's building rather than sustaining, an order that is both tolerably acceptable to us and to the Chinese, for instance. That's a formidable task. That's what the future order's got to look like. And we've seen movement on China's part in the right direction on lots of issues, but a long way to go. And so I think that that is the task before us. And with respect to that, the Europeans are important. If I think about the future of governance arrangements for the mobile web, it seems to me there's sort of a big tripartite contention going on, that our attitude, whether we say it or not, is sort of more or less let it rip, right? It's all. The European attitude is, well, we'd like to control this, but we're not quite sure if we can and how to do it. Mm-hmm. And the Chinese attitude, of course, is this is just a media like any other, and we're going to control it to the fullest extent possible. So that, we were doing some work before I left RAND on internet and web futures, and what struck us was that while the technology is moving fast, it's sort of predictable. What was harder to predict were the governing regimes around the mobile web in particular.
I think you're underscoring the word of building makes sense. Kissinger's new book on world order, he actually says it hasn't existed because there was a liberal order that was imposed, but not one that's been embraced totally. The president has said that IC developed intelligence community failed to detect the speed with which ISIS would sweep across Iraq. What were the reasons for the IC's slowness in understanding this ISIS threat? And are there any changes underway that could improve that sort of performance?
Well, I think as I look back, this is before my time, so I take no credit or no blame for this. But
that's why I thought you could be free to talk about
it. As I read back, it seems to me the community did a good job of understanding ISIL or ISIS, whatever we now call it. I mean, it was on our radar screen, we knew about it, knew its antecedents. So it was there. What was surprising, as Jim Clapper said, is how, it was not so much how good it was, but how quickly the Iraqi forces melted at the first sign of trouble. And as Jim Clapper put it, he said, the hardest thing to get right is people's will to fight, because you can see their weapons, but you can't see the quality of their souls. And so in that sense, and he cites the litany of times we've gotten it wrong. We got it wrong about our allies in Vietnam. We got it wrong about our adversaries in '93, Iraq the first time around. And we got it wrong about our allies again this time. So I suppose what's came as more surprise was how quickly the Iraqi security forces melted away. I guess I was surprised myself as an outsider by the successful brutality of ISIL or ISIS. And as I think forward, the question for me is, at what point does that become ability than it's seemed so far? To be fair, they're careful about it. So even in these latest beheading videos, they don't show the grisly stuff. They've understood that's bad, but still, it's a question for me whether the liabilities they're generating as they move so quickly will catch up with them over what time period.
One can only hope.
Yeah.
The hybrid warfare of Russia, to what extent was that something we saw coming and knew, and to what extent are we learning as we go on that one?
I think we're all learning a bit as we go, and most of what Russia did is pretty, on the warfare front, it's special units and things they can disavow. That we knew about. We hadn't seen it as much in place, being used as we have since. On the propaganda or information front, most of what they've done is pretty straightforward, control of papers and the typical, autocratic stuff. Though they have done some social media. What's interesting about social media is it sort of plays on both sides, and who gets the net advantage? We use it a lot in intelligence, and it's valuable there. It's also valuable for the practitioners like Putin and his colleagues. There, I'm not quite sure I've netted out the balance of who gains more from that, the increasing ubiquity of social media.
Well, let me actually ask one last question on that, and then I'll go to the audience. You completed a book recently, which I think is just coming out now?
Just coming out now. I just got the first copies over the weekend.
Title?
Let's see, Bridging the Divide. It's way too complicated. I used to try and think that I wanted all my titles not to have colons in them, but this one I didn't succeed. It's really about looking at science and intelligence side by side as both become more important in major public policy decisions and as both operate in circumstances that are more transparent with more possible stakeholders.
Fascinating. So why don't you give us a couple of main themes of the book before we go to the audience. But one of the themes is the slowness with which intelligence has come to grips with what you were just talking about, the explosion of open source information. In what ways do you think IC needs to adjust to the growth of open source information? You were questioning who can do this best and how do we do it the best.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. There's still a powerful current in intelligence that says, the thing we add is secrets. That's what we distinctly bring to the table. That's never been my view. I always thought that secrets are part of it, but that also information and analysis, and that means that in a world in which information is increasingly ubiquitous, we still have a process that, from my perspective, is pretty linear. Starts with requirements. We say, what do we like to know about? Then we collect against those requirements, and then we analyze what we've collected, which is fine, but it is very linear. And in the world in front of us, information is just there. And by definition, you're only going to collect a teeny fraction of it, no matter what you do, right? And therefore, having the process be driven by collection, every time we do a piece, we'll talk about collection gaps. I think we need to move away from that, as one of my predecessors, John Gannon, said. He said, open source is not an int, it's the air we breathe. It's just out there, and so trying to find ways to take advantage of it. I would put, if I'm looking at the major challenges facing all of intelligence, I'd identify two paramount ones. One is operating in a world that is much more transparent and getting more so all the time. As one of my colleagues reminds me, my car has 12 different unique emitters telling people information about me and where I am and where I'm going. So it is a much more transparent world. And the other, that imposes, I think, on intelligence the task of dealing with big data. It is, traditionally, intelligence has prized its exquisite data, particular sources, and those can still be important, but increasingly there's just so much data out there, and trying to find ways to exploit it. Social media is a perfect example where you've got huge amounts of stuff, very unreliable, very hard to validate, hard to use, but we're getting better at it, I think. But it is a big task, and it also kind of runs against the grain that says, we're in the business of applying exquisite information to hard problems.
And are you going to introduce new efforts at the NIC in terms of that sort of open source inclusion? And if so, what would be most valuable?
Well, we have an internal prediction market already, and the NIC is inheriting it. It's been interesting. So that's basically, this is not huge data, but it's aggregating in interesting ways views of people on particular problems. The good news is it turns out they're super predictors. Some people are just a lot better at this than others. That's, I suppose, no surprise. The even better news is that a little training helps. That several hours of training actually makes people quite a lot better. It helps them basically avoid coming quickly to a conclusion. That's the key. Keeping an open mind for a little longer turns out to be a real key to doing well there. So that's an example of the kind of thing I'd like us to do. I was actually, before I came to this job, looking at activity-based intelligence, so-called, which was very successful in identifying bad guys in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it did so by taking data from different sources and laying it together to develop what they called a pattern of life that would distinguish a would-be insurgent from an ordinary pious Muslim going about his or her day. And it's I like it because it disrupts this linear cycle in interesting ways. It says it's sequence neutral. It says we may find the answer before we know the question, or the piece of something we've collected today may be irrelevant today, but tomorrow we'll find a question that makes it very, very important. We'll get interested in a particular would-be insurgent, for example. And it's also tends to be data neutral. It says, data is data. If it's useful, it's useful. If it's not, it's not. And it basically says, well, let's aggregate this data for current purposes around locations, make it discoverable, make it searchable, and then people can get in the data and see if there's anything of interest about a particular location.
Interesting. Questions? Please identify yourself as you ask your question. Please wait for the microphone.
Hi, my name is Belinda, and you were talking about social media. I'm interested, obviously, it's my generation with social media. Everyone's on it, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you name it. Now, over the years, collecting and going through like data points, intelligence, is social media making it easier or harder for the intelligence community to keep up with the different facets? And also, with social media, everyone prides themselves, it's freedom of speech, and this is why I believe, this is why I think. How do you counteract those individuals who are going to the extreme side, who are recruiting here in the United States and throughout the international community to come and join their ideology and join their fight for extremists? How do you counteract that?
Yeah. Those are great questions. I think on balance, I mean, it's a huge amount of information, so therefore it's a difficult challenge. But I think on balance, social media does offer lots of advantages for intelligence. I did, when I was still at the RAND Corporation, I did a study looking at how the various agencies were exploiting external social media like Facebook and Twitter, and I found a lot more than I expected. It was really very interesting. Some interesting experiments going on. Obviously, many of them in the open source area, where the challenge there is dealing with huge volumes, enormous unreliability, trying to validate particular, and the Open Source Center does a really good job of trying to validate particular tweeters by how many times they get retweeted, by the track record, but it's all still pretty labor intensive. Trying to make it less so is the challenge. I would like social media to be more useful, not in warning, but in sort of tipping. Here's a place where analysts might look, or here's a correlation they might look at that they hadn't before. So I'm hopeful on that score. What you do about the bad guys using it, they're sometimes actions get taken, but interestingly, ISIL is not, they don't have chat rooms with passwords. They've done it all quite openly, right? And as far as one can tell, relatively successfully. That's really hard to do very much about. What you have to do then is do better yourself at the counter-narrative, getting a narrative out there. And that, I think we're getting better at, but that's not or even primarily a role for intelligence. It's a role for policy, but it's also a role for NGOs and citizens as well, to counter those particular narratives that are dangerous.
Please.
Thanks. My name is Andrei Sitov. I'm a Russian reporter here in Washington, D.C. I have a couple of questions, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for this fascinating meeting. I have a couple of questions, one on Ukraine and one on Russia. On Ukraine, we've noticed that when government spokesmen talk about the events, they very rarely cite American intelligence sources or American government sources. They mostly say, we know this from NATO, or we know it from some other sources, but rarely reference their own intelligence. Let's take, for example, the case of the destroyed plane. My question obviously is, and that obviously creates an impression that they are not straight with the public. My question is about your response to that, whether you are fully sure that you know what happened with that plane and whether we have any chance of ever finding out with the public.
This is the
Malaysian plane, yes, obviously. And that's the Ukrainian part. And then the Russian part, I mean, one funny observation I have is that as someone who, because of my job, I read all the major texts from your president and from my president. And I often see President Putin directly describing his motives, his actions in his lengthy speeches and Q&As. And then I find out that nobody reads them here. So that's like your ultimate source. How do you deal with that? that he gives you the answers, but you won't take them. Thank
Yeah.
you.
In retrospect, we all should have read the 2007 Munich Security Conference
Yes.
speech a lot more closely.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. On the last, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that I've long sung the song that, you know, you might actually listen to what people say, right? We did that, we made that mistake before the Indian nuclear test, right? The Indian leaders were pretty clear about what they were going to do, and we just didn't sort of believe them, right? We thought this was for domestic consumption or something else. So I'm very much with you. I think that as a good starting point is to listen to what people say, because they may actually do or may actually think what they say, right? So I couldn't agree more with you on that score. On the Malaysian plane, I'm confident. Yes, I'm confident we do know. And I think we laid out that case pretty clearly in public, not intelligence, but our policy colleagues. So I find that pretty compelling.
So the official version is correct.
As far as I can tell, yeah.
Please, yes.
Thank you. My name is Steve Hirsch. I'm a freelance journalist. It's been a while. My question is, with the emergence of, I'm trying not to use the word non-state actors, but I can't think of another word. The emergence of non-state actors, entities that are not governments, I'm wondering if there is an emerging need, and if it's being met in American intelligence, to work with non-intelligence sorts of organizations, by which I mean law enforcement, narcotics, sort of broader, maybe a broader description of intelligence than we used to have before, because we're now dealing with entities that are not our traditional adversaries. Thanks.
You know, you're exactly right. It's a big challenge. I think we're doing better. You know, there are lots of difficulties, mostly self-imposed, for intelligence to do that kind of thing, but it's gotten better. I think it's gotten better since I was here before. And even then, we were going to do what I hoped would be an NIE. It wasn't. It was a paper on humanitarian emergencies around the world. And we basically went to all the humanitarian NGOs and said, would you come to a conference in Washington and maybe bring a 2-page paper with you? Well, they didn't much like the idea of dealing with the government and intelligence, but that was sort of outweighed by the fact that we cared. We cared about their issue. So they all came and effectively wrote the first draft of this paper. This is now nearly 20 years ago, so it opened me then to the possibilities of intelligence reaching out. And as you say, with lots of the non-state actors, or if you're looking at places like, I did some RAND work on Sudan, you know, Sudan is just crawling with NGOs, and they've got a lot more understanding of what's going on in Sudan than U.S. intelligence is ever going to have, I suspect. So trying to tap that in ways that are acceptable to them, I think that is a very much a doable challenge. As I said, a lot of the troubles we cause for ourselves, for understandable reasons, but it does, one of the things I want the NIC to be is the piece of intelligence that's the most out there, that's the most engaged, that reaches out to experts the most. Because the more we look into the future, the less those secrets help, and the more talking to experts outside the government as well as inside is necessary.
Thank you. Please.
Mike Macetic,
Hey, Mike.
Good to see you again. How much does the kind of analysis you do rely on history? We know that frequently, particularly among journalists and politicians, there are bad historical analogies made. But a couple of us were at a thing with Stephen Kotkin, that's just written this incredible biography of Stalin.
Right.
And he said that there's a pattern going back to the czars through Stalin of Russians being a distinctive society, feeling aggrieved for one reason or another by their treatment by the West, and one of their responses is to lash out and go conquer somebody. I mean, maybe other people have different views of that, but how does the role of history and historians play into developing judgments about how other countries and governments are going to do things?
Great question.
It is a great question. I think probably too little is the easy answer. We certainly try and be historically aware when we do things, but you know, the historical memories of most Americans don't go back very far. They think the world was created a couple days ago, right? And so it is a challenge. A lot of the pieces I see once in a while, done by the CIA and others, is they'll take an issue and look at how it's played out in other cases, in other similar cases through, but mostly recent history, probably not going back very far. I find that very useful too, but we don't do enough of that. But trying then to get a longer historical sweep, I think that is a real challenge. If you take the Middle East now, it's easy not to go much further back than, yeah, Maliki was a really bad guy, and there's Sunnis and Shias. Well, that's a start, but there's also a lot of history behind that is relevant as well. ISIS didn't come out of nowhere, and it probably didn't just come out of those two things, right? So I think the more we can do better history, the better, but it's, as you can imagine, it's a little bit swimming against the tide.
Let me ask one question about one of your most important products. Every year, the Director of National Intelligence briefs to Congress an annual threat assessment, and the NIC produces it for him. So what I've been told by people who have watched the history of this assessment is that it keeps getting longer and longer, and I don't know whether that's because they want to make sure they haven't missed the threat that actually happens. But if you're looking at the threats, in this world of threats, 1, 2, 3, the ones that concern you the most, what are they, and how do you prioritize more in this assessment?
It's a good question. This is it's an interesting hybrid exercise. There's a classified version of it that goes to the committees, and then there's the unclassified version of it that gets some attention. It's hard in an unclassified version to be as clear about priorities as you would like, even if you had them yourself, because the more you give priority to something, you're not giving priority to something else, and that has all sorts of consequences inside not just the government but the society. So I sort of gave you my personal list of kind of the top of my threat list, but it's bound to reflect obviously the things that we're currently preoccupied with. Those will no doubt be at the top of the list in any case. And I think that they deserve it because they're something we're having to work on actively, take risks, spend money, do things about. So those will be prominent. How much beyond that we can in the unclassified version do priorities? For me, it remains to be seen. I haven't done this exercise before, so I'm looking forward to it.
Great, thank you. Please, and the gentleman here with the glasses, and then I'll go to the back. I see people getting and come back here. Thank you.
Hi, Fred Tipson at the Institute of Peace. Greg, how do you factor into your judgments the stresses from demographic bulges and climate volatility and the sorts of things that must be in your new book?
Yeah, we do. We talk about that a lot in the new book, and they factor into all our work all the time. And I think it is, it's often said that demographics is destiny, and the more you look out, the more important it becomes. So I hope we do a good job. We certainly try hard at the NIC. We have a strategic futures group, and they've done an awful lot of good work on the implications of climate change, sort of the political and security implications of climate change, which is probably the right focus for us. Also good work on demographics as well as governance, and there are interesting cells around the government. I see some representatives here who are doing similar thinking about state instability, about youth bulges, about those things. So there's I think a lot of good work. The challenge is always, it's easy to say about a particular state, well, this state is vulnerable, but policy people understandably want, well, when is something going to happen? What's the trigger, right? And that's very hard. Who would have thought that a salesman in Tunisia would have had the kind of effect that event had? So I think we do a good job at understanding the basic dynamics. When those dynamics are going to produce an interesting change or event, that's a real challenge.
Please.
Hey,
Hi. Hi, Greg. Roger Cliff of the Atlantic Council. I just wanted to actually leverage off of that last point. In your earlier talk about using much more open source, publicly available information in the past. So what is, I mean, there's lots of academics and people in think tanks and so on who are looking at the same issues that you are. What's the comparative advantage of the intelligence community when it comes to doing this kind of analysis?
By this kind, you mean thinking about the future, or?
Yeah, thinking about the future. I mean, obviously, when it comes to, tell me what frequencies that unit's operating on,
Right.
the intelligence community is going to have an advantage there. But looking at broader global trends and how they're going to affect events that affect in the near or far future, what's the comparative advantage of the intelligence community in that sort of analysis?
I hope it's bringing together the best minds out there and trying to synthesize, adding nuggets where we have them from unusual sources if they're relevant. And I suppose it comes back to what you think the point of a particular piece is. For instance, we just did a work on global energy, and that there was classified information relevant, but we didn't use much of it because we didn't need to. It was mostly from diplomatic reporting and open source. And there I think what the value, the reason for doing that from my perspective was a kind of foundational one, that we can help set the terms of the discussion, have a common vocabulary for working on a particular problem. And that seems to me a useful function that our more strategic pieces can do. We did that half a year ago before I got there on cyber. And there too, it seems to me the contribution of that piece was in a frame and language that would be useful as to policy discussions of that particular issue.
Please,
Lieutenant Colonel Sylwia Szawowska from the Polish Defense Attaché Office. I have two questions. First one is, could you please expand on how you see the, let's say, the performance of the intelligence community on the prognosis of the happenings in Ukraine and Putin's policy, because I have an impression that Intel didn't do too well on that. And the second one, you were saying about the not being dominated by tactics, and what I see as far as the policy is that it's a more campaign style. So how do you assess the capability you have to translate the Intel message to the White House? Whether you're doing really good on that? Thank you.
One of the good things about this for me has been that really the quality of the communication between intelligence, between the NIC and the National Security Council staff in particular is very intense. It's a very intense give and take, and we get thank you notes, we get questions, we get kicks from time to time. But I'm impressed by a stream of thank you notes. Often the thank you notes say, "Thanks for doing this in 12 hours." Right? So they're more about timing than about quality. But this is an administration that seems to very receptive to intelligence. It doesn't mean that they necessarily follow our advice if there's advice or believe what we say, but we're heard, and that's I think that's the main thing you can ask if you're trying to do intelligence to make better policy. On Ukraine, I really haven't looked hard at it. It kind of was in motion when I got there, so I don't think I really have a very tutored view of how well we did or didn't do. And of course, it depends a lot on what you think Mr. Putin's time horizon and decision making was like.
please. I think we'll make this last question with one wrap-up question from me. And then I think you're all then, after that, invited to a reception outside to greet the new chairman of the NIC.
Yeah, Joe Marks from Politico. I wanted to follow up on the cybersecurity issue that you mentioned a couple of times. You said it was one of the things you're looking at most in the long range, and I'm wondering how NIC looks at an issue, how NIC looks at cyber, an issue like cyber, where you're looking at technological change over a series of 10 or 15 years as opposed to, one nation's, national interest?
Let me pile on to that
Okay.
since this is a closing question. Let's take that one. And also, you're expanding to, and this is not entirely cyber, it's broader in technology issues, but you're including in the NIC a new National Intelligence Officer focused on civil technology.
Right.
And maybe you can talk to us also a decision, where that decision comes from and how well, particularly in the spirit of your new book, does the IC do in following science and technology trends, and how important is that going to be going forward as well? Those two things.
Well, on the cyber issue, obviously, there's a lot of forward-looking work to be done, but there's a pretty steady stream of questions as well. My NIO for cyber is in touch with people in the private sector, and they're talking about. So there's a steady stream of current stuff happening there too. Not a lot of policymaking meetings on it, but it's not just trying to think more strategically, though I think that's real important in the cyber realm. On S&T.
And the reason I ask that is we've done some big reports on disruptive technologies, whether it's bio, whether it's big data, or whether it's additive manufacturing, whether it's human enhancement. I mean, there's a lot coming at us, and so that's the sort of context of this question.
Yeah, I think we've had a NIO for science and technology for some time. He now mostly does space, so we're trying to have a NIO that focuses mostly on science and technology, mostly on civil, though it's very hard to separate these anymore. IT is the most obvious example. So my impression is that no more than that, is that the community does a pretty good job at following military technology, military-specific technology, a much less good job at following civilian and dual-use kinds of technologies, or ones that not so much dual use. We probably do a pretty good job of those, but ones that are inherently on that fuzzy line between civil and military can be used for both. So that's trying to beef up that capacity for us. A lot of people are out there doing scans of science and technology. It's always interesting to me. I feel like I've been hearing about nanotechnology for a very long time, and nothing much has quite happened. I suppose the proposition there is that technological breakthroughs or technological changes have more effect once they go through the social fabric, but may take longer to go through the social fabric than you think. I mean, the internet's a nice example where it took 40 years, I suppose, both for the technology to develop and for the social arrangements to coalesce around it to make it really useful. So it makes these, I think it makes technology forecasts I find fun to do, but one of my colleagues who's a long-term planner says, if thinking about the longer term doesn't affect what you do today, it's only entertainment. And I like the entertainment, but I don't get to do entertainment at my current job, so trying to make it useful to our work today is critical.
And sometimes relatively simple technologies, fracking, hydraulic drilling, end up having geopolitical consequences that were really hard to foresee.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm also impressed by the things that don't happen, right? If we'd had this conversation in 1950, we would have all said, well, energy will be cheap, be free by this point in history, because we would have thought nuclear energy would have didn't quite turn out that way, right? So I'm intrigued as much by the dogs that never bark as the interesting ones that do.
Greg, thank you so much. Let me just close this by quoting your boss, General Clapper, one more time. The right man at the right time, you can see by the intellectual quality with which he handles these questions and the experience you bring to the job. And we wish you the best of luck, and we'll be helpful wherever we can be.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks. Right.